Hello and welcome to Beyond Top 10 Tennis. My name is Dr. Dr Berge and I'm your host. I'm the author of 11 books, CEO of 12 years, the founder of a startup set on data privacy, and most importantly, I'm an elite performance coach, having worked with athletes for over 18 years throughout Europe, the United States to Australia. And I think most substantially, I am the world's leading scientist on coach and athlete performance that has used tennis specifically to uncover how to develop that top 10 tennis ranking. That's right, and look, if this is your first time tuning in, it's incredibly exciting. But look, if you've been listening with us for a while, thank you so much, but you also know what we're all about. I'm behind theories such as the optimal performance theory, the V by Dr. B to the rule of transference. I've coined terms from the barrier breaker to the golden rule. And as has become custom each episode, we're going to dive into one of my books, dig a little bit deeper, share additional insights, and just really just answer those hidden questions that you may or may not have, but to really, dive towards and dig deep towards delivering on that top 10 tennis ranking. So as always, buckle in and enjoy the ride. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Look, today's episode, it's really piggybacking off our previous episode around learning, around education, academia, and everything that's wrapped up into that. And we've got some really good takeaways today. And so look, we're focusing on the secrets to optimal performance success, a comprehensive discussion on developing elite coaches and players. And look, if you want to follow along today, we are on page 149 and we're focusing on learning the role of academia in sport. Now, it's probably no surprise that the previous episode and today's episode, look, they're a part of the one chapter. So if you've been following along for a while, that we know we've been focusing on the learning process that is buckled in, or intertwined within these pages. And it's such, a fundamental and important topic to address when we're looking at that, that elite performance pathway. And I think when we're looking at the elite performance spectrum, more often than not, it gets confused with, well, it must only be applicable if you are ranked, 50 in the world, or maybe it's applicable if you are ranked, just 100 in the world. But we're saying the pathway's actually been designed whether you're that aspiring 8-year-old, that aspiring 14-year-old, or you are ranked 200 in the world, or you're ranked 20 in the world. Because irrespective of what your ranking is, we know that you are going to be along that pathway at some stage. And that's, I think, the most exciting part about the 7 keys and how they're integral at each milestone and how they can be implemented and solidified at each milestone. So when we really want to have that conversation about learning and education, we really want to set up the foundations. If you are that 8, 9, 10-year-old, or you were still in that developmental phase, so maybe you are, let's say for argument's sake, 16 and under, being privy to that knowledge now sets you up for success long term. If, however, you are 21, 22, and you were not afforded these resources or access to this 10 years ago, which is fair because it wasn't available back then. So it just means that you need to put the work in now. And everyone else around your age or older is in the same boat, so it's okay. But when we're looking at developing the next generation of players, if you are able to harness this knowledge, harness and integrate the 7 keys, we know what that pathway looks like. We know the end goal there is a top 10 tennis ranking, which is incredibly exciting, incredibly rewarding. And look, I know I touch on this almost maybe every episode. It's not something that we really thought was possible. It was really a win in the best possible way, because with my playing and coaching background, I knew about the optimal performance parameters. However, without that doctorate behind me, it was really just an opinion. And opinions are wonderful, but unless it's substantiated and you have that scientific rigor, it's very different. And it was also a case, we know more often than not, unfortunately, the sporting landscape is predominantly dominated by males when we're looking at, I guess, the coaching fraternity. And if you are a woman listening, thank you. But that is to say that, or isn't to say, sorry, that it's not becoming more of an even playing field, but we have a long way to go. And obviously I'm being talking about tennis specifically here. Some sports are more progressive in this area than others, but when we're looking at specifically here that the knowledge share and that cycle of knowledge and upskilling coaches and how we have very let's say older implications and mindsets that are not synonymous with that top 10 tennis ranking. And I only have to look in my own backyard. So I am based in Australia, and we know why specifically we don't have top 10 tennis players in Australia, why we don't have the systems in place that are like other federations that have players that are more populated in the top 100 on tour. Though we still really want to be mindful of, again, touching on today's episode around education, the detriment there and the rate and or ratio of injury, its prevention / mitigation and or development. And we really want to be mindful of, I guess, access, so accessibility and affordability. AMAT International was built specifically for the 7 keys and my other texts to be available to you. So whether you are that player, that coach, that parent, that guardian, or another individual that aspires to reach an optimal performance parameter in play and or in life, the key here is that if that body of work was just with a federation and or coach provider, you would not have access or the same level of accessibility. And again, as that former player to coach, I knew how important that was, because if I put myself in your shoes, I want access. I want to know how. And look, if you listen to our last episode specifically, you would have heard me touch on injuries, the ones I've personally had, the ones I personally still carry, and I only touched on just that one, but there's a long list there, so you're not going to envy me in that respect. And when we talk about, obviously, when we're developing, those elite performance parameters, we really want to mitigate the onset of injuries and or the likelihood of developing those injuries. And if you've been in my shoes and you have developed those injuries, of course you know what that feels like, and you would do everything you can, if you were that coach out there, to prevent, I hope, your player from experiencing the same. And if you're that parent and or guardian out there, of course you want to protect your child from developing the same, because 1, they suck. 2, they're no fun. But I think 3, most substantially, they regress those performances, which means if you've been progressing towards a peak performance or a peak level of play, again, that we touched on in the previous episode, and having that regress, and then you progress, and then you regress, you can see that the time, the energy, not just physically, but also emotionally and mentally, that takes away from that player, that athlete, your child, for example, when we're looking at that pathway. And it really doesn't matter, I think, what stage you're at on that pathway. Obviously, if you've been on the pathway for a long time and you've had a lot of hits, it's a lot more painful. But if you are, I guess, in that developmental bracket and you get your first hit, it's not as heartbreaking when you're 14. I mean, it's still no fun by all means. But when you get your next hit at 15, then 16, then 17, then 18, then 19, and then 20, and that was me, I've been there. And you peak, and then you drop, you peak, and then and so on and so forth. That's when something's not right. And for my case personally, it was really about those technical foundations and building that and having that healthy balance and knowing the work that needs to be done. So, and that's a lot of the work is around that, is that we know how to re-educate ourselves now. We know what it takes to develop that top 10 tennis player. And obviously the pathway and the long game at AMA International. But what we're really talking about here is that we know the work, we know those techniques, the technical parameters that you need to apply, which means we know how you need to be conditioning or conditioned to serve, to volley, to hit those ground strokes, to those approaches, all right? The agility and the conditioning that takes, that level of movement, to flexibility even, and how you can integrate that, how you need to build that, how they are stepping stones, and it's the staggered approach. Which is wonderful in a way, because that's how all of my texts, for example, have been designed. It's a staggered approach because we learn progressively. We don't learn in just one big hit. It's that staggered approach. So again, as I guess these episodes show and share, we start at one point and we progress, and we'll continue to progress, because I think that's the beauty of it. But it's also the beauty of the science behind it, and I guess my books, that we progress. And this is just the beginning, the secrets to optimal performance success. It's the first one. And again, if you've been listening along, you already know how rich the work is and the depth involved there. So you can only imagine how much deeper we go in the second and the third, and we're at 10, and my 12th will be out, all going well, obviously, later this year. So, but again, we come back to the relevance then of education and learning, and really how that's intertwined there. So, and when we look at the role of learning and in academia, in sport, we look at those foundations that have those similarities, so that cross-section there with education and sport. So it's not just tennis. It doesn't really matter in this case what sport you're playing. Obviously, I do like focusing on tennis, but a lot of the work is cross-transferable. So I've touched on this recently about the rule of transference, which I've coined, and we know with the science and the data that a lot of these, I think, positive implications are transferable to other sports, which means for the parents, if you've got a child that aspires to be that elite tennis player and you have another child that aspires to be that elite basketball player, for example, we have cross sections in the best possible way, for example. So refocusing back to the education, the learning structure, what we know is that how we condition. So, and we know we can condition our from a learning standpoint, how that child, that athlete, that player learns in the classroom. And if we can empower that learning curve and we reach a peak, how that can transfer onto the tennis court or sporting field. But the work needs to be done. And we need to also make sure that balance is there. And I've touched on this in previous episodes and also the last episode, because again, this is let's say a piggyback episode. And it's really about, we're building those foundations, but we really need that conducive learning environment, so the positive one. If you're not too sure, I did elaborate more in the previous episode, so please refresh. So if we have that conducive learning environment and we really know how we're learning, so children, so we're looking at that, I guess, at developmental age, so, and let's say 16 and under, we know how learning is fundamental and how it can optimize performances later. And not just in play, but again, like in life, as the 7 keys touches on. But what we're saying is, at some point, you're learning, you begin to learn, and your learning is near exponential, depending obviously what you're focusing on, or where that focus lies. Obviously, if you are still in that schooling system, within that age bracket, there are key areas that you are learning, but it's pivotal to call on, I think, the different facets of that education and how it's shaping your ability to retain information, for example, to problem solve, and essentially to apply that in your sport of choice, and how it can be applicable in tennis. And look, people may or may not see the correlation or the similarities between that, that tennis player and that child then who's learning, let's say, for example, the Pythagoras' theorem, which is very common and popular in maths. I don't know if it is now, so I could be dating myself. But if you are a coach parent out there, you're probably familiar with this. But what we're saying is that who would think that you could transfer that to the tennis court? Now, if you're a big fan of his work and obviously you're really into mathematics, you can see when you're creating those angles on the tennis court how you can have fun with that. And we really want to look at how you can transfer these tools, this level of education, these new skill sets, and you transfer them, because not only if you're a lover of tennis, it helps and again amplifies that learning, and you can transfer that then because it piques that interest because you see its relevance. If you do not have that relevance, that pique it's not as fun. But that is a modification in that education or environment that we've touched on in tennis when we're looking at those modifications. Now, this does not stop a player who is 16, 17, 18 years of age and older to use the same tools. This is going to be made even more complicated for good reason, because as you reach that new level of play, you need that new level of complexity, because your ability to think it's on fire in the best possible way, and you want to amplify that. You want to benefit from that, so you're able to anticipate and react quicker and quicker and quicker, hopefully quicker than your opponent. And you can use inadvertent tools to be able to do that and condition that, and to get you on, I guess, that path to be able to again amplify that and dig into that. And I guess what I'm talking about here is how we can leverage education. And you could think outside the box as specifically as learning a new language. Now, if you're bilingual or multilingual, and we see this is very common in athletes on tour, and for good reason. But what we see also is if you're able to translate very quickly from your native tongue, so your native language, into another language, that ability to process and think is incredible. And being able to do that more readily, it is constantly challenging in the best possible way. Now, you've reached that level after you have done, I guess, those typical school years that have set you up to understand those basic concepts from the beginning. because I can't tell you how often I go, well, of course I understand that, but I go, well, how in the world did I learn that? Or when did the learning of that subject or topic begin? Now, though that foundationary learning obviously is in those primary school, the elementary, those years. And then it progressive towards, whether it's the high school, towards your freshman year and so forth, to your juniors to senior years. Now, obviously, it depends what schooling system you were in and I guess the relevance there. So in Australia, we go from primary to high school, and essentially we're looking at towards that 16, 17 years of age, sometimes 18 years, depending where you are. In different places where you're based around the world, it's similar, it differs just slightly. Though what we're touching on is that level of progression. And we've touched on your rate of progress in previous episodes. And we have a chapter specifically designated to this. So we know your rate of progress is at one point and it will progress to the next and next. So your rate of progress starts fresh. And it starts fresh with that new level of knowledge, with that new peak performance. So our key objective, like right now, is to get you to your next peak performance. What peak performance are you working on now? Because throughout your career, irrespective of what level you're at, you will get a peak, then a peak, then a peak. You are continuously reaching that peak. Obviously, if you are derailed or sidelined with an injury, you get that regression. So once you've got the regression, then that peak could be where you were at. So wherever that peak was, you want to get back there, and you might need to break that down into individual peaks, which is okay. That's a lot of peaks there. Okay, so I think that's run its course. So I'm going to dive into the chapter now, pull out some key segments for you to follow along. So again, if you want to follow along, we're on page 149. Learning and the role of academia in sport. When it comes to learning, regardless of the domain, players and students alike share a common denominator, the capacity to learn. All human beings have the capacity to learn, whether that be on the sporting field or in the classroom. This is what I was touching on, and it's absolutely fundamental, because it does not matter how old you are, it does not matter your age. Learning is synonymous. It's across the board. And that means whether you are that 5-year-old, that 10-year-old, that 25-year-old, that 35-year-old, you have the capacity to learn. Obviously, some will have more of an insatiable appetite for learning than others, and that's okay. But you will have something that you love more than other topics, subjects, courses, etc., which is great. That's where your learning and your interest is going to peak and gravitate towards. But as humans, because again, we like taking that humanized approach, is that we're all individuals. We are all human. We all have the ability to learn. And that transfers then, specifically if we're looking at the tennis player, onto the tennis court. But the ability to learn in and of itself gets you there in the first place. Equally, the process of learning in itself is applicable to any learning environment. For instance, at the very basic level, the capacity to count and memorize numbers is developed over time in the classroom. It's a very simple example, but bear with me. This skill is useful and necessary in sports to keep track of the score at the simplest level. On a more complex level, when learning algebra and the different equations necessary to find the ultimate solution and the answer, its applicability to sports may be questioned. Now, this is where I differ. I personally believe the problem solving involved in algebra, for example, the methods required to find and unravel the answer, are essential tools that are not only beneficial in critical thinking, but also transferable to the sporting environment. Now, just quickly, it should be clarified here and made apparent that algebra is merely an example, and different disciplines such as science, English, or economics, for instance, have equally as much to contribute. And I think that is an incredibly powerful paragraph there, and it really sets up the pretense here of the role of academia in sports, and the role of education really more specifically in sport and how we learn, and the inadvertent learning there that is established and involved, whether it's through the classroom, for more mature players, university, or varying courses, that really is accessible. And again, for the coaches out there, the 7 keys and the text that are accessible in a book, that you are able to upskill that knowledge base and learn and push, I think, it further to know what is really behind developing that top 10 tennis player, and specifically what is involved in developing a top 10 tennis player's coach. And that is really key, because a lot of the work is also wrapped up in that, because you cannot develop a top 10 tennis player obviously without that coach. Obviously there are slight discrepancies there, but when we look at that, and specifically if you're that coach working with that player athlete, that's obviously your end goal. You want to get them towards that peak, and for you to do that, we know that you need access to the 7 keys, which that's obviously where AIMA International comes in. But that's where your upskilling is concerned. That's where your learning is concerned. That is where your, that role of academia in sport for the coaches, this is where your learning framework is concerned. And if you can put in the work here, that's what will amplify your performance then as a coach. Obviously, if you want to go along, I guess that tangent there, go, no, I know everything, I'm good. Well, that's okay. We know that's not the case. But hopefully you're listening to this because you know that, and that you really want to know how you can develop that, your player, your athlete, towards that top 10 tennis ranking. This is where we start. This is how we get there, and we remove the opinions. We're talking science, and we're talking data, and really how to get that, which is really exciting. For the parents out there, that's absolutely fundamental, because you want a coach that is privy to this and knows this, and is able to role model the role of education and that continuation of learning to your child, to that player, to that athlete. And again, we've touched on multiple times in previous episodes the role of role models and the ability to empower that child, that player, that athlete. And the role that coaches play in this respect is incredibly important when we're looking at that pathway and the longevity there in place for the long game. Now, if we really want to get down to the nitty-gritty then for the players, the athletes, these are accessible for you too, which means if you want access to the secrets to optimal performance success and the other texts, because again, there's 11 now, 10 specifically here that we're talking about, there's nothing stopping you. Now, there's a very good chance that depending your rate of progress, if you are at that developmental stage, you may only grasp most of the earlier text and then potentially get lost along the way in the later text, because the later text, there are progress, and that's where your schooling, so your level of education, will come into play. If you have been paying attention in the classroom, again, conducive environment, then you will understand even more If not, they're encouraged to push you and that learning curve for the players and athletes to nudge your education even higher and further. Now look, the same is applicable to coaches and parents too. It will nudge you closer. It walks you through from the beginning, which is where we are now, the secrets to optimal performance success, the very beginning. It's that staggered approach, which means it gets more complex. We start very simple, but I think that's what I love so much about this work, is that I take your hand, so to speak, and guide you through, the books do. Not merely how to develop that top 10 tennis ranking, but in a way which I think is really cool, that pushes you further. So it pushes your learning curve, that learning structure even further. So you're at this one point, and then you can progress towards that next point and that next inadvertently. Because when we do it inadvertently, we're not paying attention, but that inadvertent process is also leading us to optimize our performances, because we have that obviously critical thinking. We're able to understand new concepts more readily, and we are able to familiarize ourselves with those newer, I think, approaches to those concepts, which no longer essentially are new, because we've become very familiar. And I say that in the best possible way, because the more we're able to nudge ourselves and nudge ourselves and nudge ourselves, we're optimizing our performances again. And that's really what it's all about. Because when we're continuously pushing ourselves and we're able to reach that new peak, whatever our peak performance was for us 3 months ago, it's going to be very different in another 3 months. And that is the benefit of having those optimal performance landmarks, if you like, before you reach your next. Too often, emphasis is put on one or the other, school or sport. Equally, one is most often compromised for the benefit of the other. It is common practice for a lot of athletes, particularly in their developmental years, to compromise their studies, so their schooling, as a result of their sporting commitments. It is well known that sporting commitments can take priority, and the importance of schooling and how it contributes to the developmental process of the athlete is often forgotten and thus neglected. And I think that's a really important topic to finish on there, because, and again, I touched on this in the previous episode. When you start neglecting the importance of that education structure as a whole, and how it really has those inadvertent benefits for that athlete, that's where you're losing the long game. So it's not conducive. And I say that because if you're able to equip that child, that player, that athlete with that knowledge landscape, so that's available to them, whether it's in that classroom or that learning environment. And look, this comes in different shapes, frames, forms these days, whether it's online, small group, it's immersive, it's individual. Now, some are more popular than others, but this is not about those choices there. It's about that upkeep, making sure that child is learning. Now, if you're that 15, 16-year-old, we still want you to still be learning and finding what works best for you to still learn, not just play tennis. And then when you're that 18, 19-year-old, you're able to say bye to school, hopefully, and you're playing. And at that stage, you could be the top 800 in the world, top 100 in the world, top 50 in the world, depending, I guess, on your rate of progress. But please still keep that learning up, whether it is on a smaller scale or a larger scale, it's completely up to you. But being able to be mindful of that power of learning and how that education can benefit your performance it's fundamental. And for the coaches out there, please encourage this. And obviously, once you've done those formal years, and those baseline or those standard learning the subjects, we will say you get to discover something new and study potentially, hopefully, you're even more passionate about, more interested in, that you can really dig deeper. And in the best way, there's a level of balance there that we've touched on about your identity. So that identity crisis that can happen with athletes at times, because their sport is their whole world, can be a little bit dissuaded when education is able to enlighten us with something else we also are curious about and can enjoy. But more so, obviously, as we've touched on today, that inadvertent learning that still happens. And, I touched on again in the previous episode, because look, this is the piggyback episode, about how that learning really can amplify your performance, whether it's from your anticipation to your ability to react, and you're looking at that minuscule difference when we're edging towards the top 10 and we're following that pathway. If you want to know more, obviously, about the long game, that's on AMA International, and it takes you through that 10 years, whether it's 800 in the world to top 20 in the world and top 10 to top 5 even, which is incredibly exciting. But I really hope if there's anything that you've taken from today's episode, it's really running home the power of education, but also learning, but even more so, I think the role of academia, whether you are in primary school, high school, you're in your sophomore year, your senior year, you've started, your first year of university, or maybe you're doing your master's, or you're coming to join the club to do your PhD. It doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, irrespective of where you are on that scale, there are so many inadvertent benefits. Some of them are directly, obviously, correlated, and so they're not inadvertent. But they are able to also, I think, is what we really want to talk about here to amplify our performance. So again, if we're looking at developing that top 10 tennis ranking, we really want to equip ourselves with that learning structure that is conducive to picking up those new tools, being responsive, being able to understand and engage to, again, head towards that top 10 tennis ranking. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really hope you enjoyed today's episode and you got those key pieces. Look, to grab a copy of The Secrets to Optimal Performance Success, head on over to AM8 International. That's am8international.com. For any comments or questions, please head on over to Topic Thread. That is the only social network I am on. Although Beyond Top 10 Tennis is now on, whether it's Threads, Twitter, Instagram, Medium, and TikTok. Please come and say hi. Especially on TikTok, we have multiple tips shared throughout the week. So they're in addition to the tips shared here. And also on Spotify, you will see polls to questions that you can answer and contribute towards our episodes as well, which is a bit of fun. And hopefully, with today's episode, from that educational standpoint, will push you a little bit further to think about what's most important to you. Look, if you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, follow, like. That would be absolutely phenomenal. If you've been listening for a while now, thank you so much, and for your feedback, please keep it coming. If this is your first episode that you're tuning in for, please send some feedback. I really hope you enjoy it, and we've come a long way, I think, but I still hope we're going to keep getting better. So again, thank you so much and for your support. I will leave all the links, as always, in the episode notes. And I think, again, on that note, it's time to wrap it up. So I really hope you enjoyed today's episode. I'm just so grateful for you tuning in. Thank you so much. I am your host, Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge, and this is Beyond Top 10 Tennis, and I'll see you next time.